Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan LaPerla. I'm the Director of Public Services at the Ferguson Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Friends Author Series program that we're presenting in partnership with the Darien Library. We like to call the Friends our secret sauce. They bring many fine programs to the library, including books for babies, the literary competition, and in better times, the literary pub crawl and our family mini golf event. They also run two bookshops at the Harry Bennett branch and the main library and support the library's book discussion groups, musical programs, children's craft afternoons, and our summer reading clubs. Thank you so much, friends, for everything you do. We're especially pleased to welcome our special guest author, David Michaelis, tonight. David is the New York Times bestselling author of Schultz and Peanuts, and N.C. Wyeth, which won the Ambassador Book Award for biography. His writing has appeared in Vanity Fair, American Heritage, Life, Reader's Digest, American Scholar, and Best American Essays. His latest book is Eleanor. In conversation tonight with David is Friends Board member Mary Thies. I'd also like to say that David's books are available from our partner independent bookshop, Elm Street Books in New Canaan. You'll find their contact information in the chat. And also to let you know that following the conversation, there will be time for questions and answers. So please put any questions you have for David in the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming David and Mary. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks so much, Susan. Great to be here. Hi, Mary.
Hi, David. So as Susan mentioned, you're known for writing what's perhaps the definitive biography of N.C. Wyeth, and also an extraordinary biography of Charles Schulz. Very different people, but even though they're both artists. So tell us why you chose to write about Eleanor Roosevelt. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, Eleanor there's a personal side to that question, and there's also a more historical side. And the historical one, I think, really is that we are at this moment now, especially now, of wondering about how we learned the history of the 20th century. Did we hear the truth about it when we were taught the history? What was the truth then? What is the truth now? Why, why when we rewrite history, do we look to a subject like Eleanor? I think the reason today is that she's speaking to us about the exact fights that she fought in her lifetime that we're now re-engaged in for the survival and expansion of our multiracial pluralist democracy is back up for grabs. That was very much on the chopping block in Eleanor's time in the White House. What are Americans? What are patriots? Why is a minority power seeking absolute control over the majority? Eleanor has so much to teach us about this new fight for our right to vote, for gender equity, for America's place in a global international world. All that aside, what really inspired me was she was a household god in my childhood. And I mean, she was the figure who I kind of thought somehow might be somehow even related. She seemed like possibly not a grandmother, I knew who my grandparents were, but possibly an aunt, a great aunt. That when I was very young, my mother worked for her. That was really my earliest connection. My mother, there's a personal connection here, which is that my mother, who actually died 40 years ago tonight, oddly enough, it's an odd anniversary that my brother actually reminded me of today, and I thought of all day. My mother in 1959-60 was working with Henry Morgenthau and Paul Noble, the other producers, on the Eleanor Roosevelt program. It's called Prospects for Mankind. It was on WGBH TV, very primitively in educational TV days in Cambridge, Mass. The studio was in Waltham. And every month she would go to New York and pick out Mrs. Roosevelt, pick out her dress that she would wear that month on the program. She would sit down and work on the script with her. They would talk about who the guests were. And my mother's memories of Eleanor were alive both after Eleanor died in 1962, and she continued to be a presence in our lives growing up. But I definitely remember one of the things my mother said about her when I was a child, which was that when she would, another of her jobs, my mother was the only woman working on the program, and that's why she chose the dress with Mrs. Roosevelt. She also had another kind of feminine moment with this this personage, this figure of history, which was every um, every program, Eleanor would take a nap just before the program began, and my mother's job was to go into the room where she was napping and just lightly tap her on the shoulder. And I remember her once talking about how when she put her hand on Mrs. Roosevelt's shoulder, she sort of felt a kind of electricity, an energy, a mana. And I remember thinking, wow, that is I want to know what that is. I want to know what that is in somebody for real. And I do remember being about 4 and going to the studio and seeing her coming toward where I was and thinking to myself that this was a person that you could ask for something and probably get it. And I asked her for a stick of chewing gum. I sort of blurted out the words juicy fruit. And from her came a kind of mirth and amusement, but also again, a kind of pouring out of from her eyes energy and light and goodness. And I remember re-encountering that later in my adult life. I encountered that one other time with the painter Andrew Wyeth when I was writing about his father, when I met him first to write about his father. And he had a noticing eye. Eleanor had a noticing eye. She was known by people who knew her well to stare almost at you. She would look very carefully and closely at you. And her noticing eye, when it lit up, brought this light out into the room. And Andrew Wyeth did the same thing, strangely enough. And I remember when I first saw it in Andrew Wyeth, I thought, I've seen that somewhere before. And that's when I remembered, actually. It was a memory from being so young that it suddenly dawned on me. All of which is to say, Eleanor Roosevelt was someone who not only was ripe, I thought, for rediscovery in a political and personal and historical sense, but I knew that she was going to be, for me, a figure who was going to remain alive and remain active in my imagination every single morning. And I could never have predicted that for 9 years, that's exactly what happened, because
Wow.
I would have thought it would have gone, I would have become a bit more of a job. There was never a day in this room where I didn't wake up thinking, I can't wait to get to work.
Wow. 9 years it took you to produce this book.
9 years. And it was a really worthwhile 9 years. I don't regret a single extra day, although Simon & Schuster, I think, was a little annoyed with me for coming in so late, but which goes with the territory. But that it is a single volume biography is, to this day, to me, a miracle. And by that I mean there are dozens of books about Eleanor Roosevelt. There are hundreds of biographies of the Roosevelts. There was a outstanding 3-volume biography of Eleanor when I began. But not since 1959 had there been a 1-volume just focusing with Eleanor as the focus of the narrative. And that was really my mission. That was my job. And it was daunting. And 9 years went by like a morning, which was because this life goes from the Victorian age to the atomic age, and everything in between, every moment you can find, from the Spanish-American War to the beginning of women's suffrage, to the beginning of World War I, to the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote, prohibition, women's groups exploding into the 20s in the political world, the Depression, the stock market crash, the Depression, World War II, the Cold War. Every single thing that happens in America that's important, Eleanor Roosevelt is right in the middle of, and sometimes a crucial player at the center of, and or just adjacent to the center of. And I mean, to find, for instance, just a minor example, she's the first person to speak to the United States when the Japanese Empire of Japan attacks our naval base at Pearl Harbor. FDR, the president, spoke the next day to Congress. Eleanor's voice was the steadying voice that night, on Sunday night, that spoke to the American people and shared people's fears and explained what was happening and calmed people and reached out and said, essentially, I trust and believe in you to get through this with your neighbor, with me, with all, we're going to get through this together. And her ability to create that community, I saw from her childhood, where she created communities in her own family, which was a dysfunctional, horribly dysfunctional family, and created communities in her then, or the family that she was adopted into as an orphan, and the school she went to. And so everything about Eleanor was always a kind of synectical, from the particular to the universal, modular building. And I was, as I say, stunned that it finally did all end up in one book. Because
Wow.
it's worthy of, and Blanche Wiesen-Cook has written a beautiful 3-volume biography of Eleanor. And yet, I think if you do the whole thing all at once, as in charades, if you really, because sometimes you can leave these long volumes, these long studies, and wonder, well, who is she really? And I think people were leaving some of the books about Eleanor wondering, well, who is she? And that was what I was really attempting. And it seems odd, with so many books, I mean, behind me, that those are Roosevelt books, and that's just a fraction. That's just a book addict's version of the Roosevelt library. That's just me. I to this day can't believe that. I mean, for instance, when I was writing, every season there'd be at least 3 new books about Eleanor. There would be, and they would be slivers. They would be Eleanor and her cousin Alice, Eleanor and her father, Eleanor and labor. So you can break this down into tiny pieces. You can do it but to see the life whole, cradle to grave, that's my job. That was my job, and that's I think, kind of the excitement of it too. To me, to this day, I still think it's extraordinary to find the transformation of a single person in one life, in one book, in one story, because it's one of the most transformative of American lives.
And I'm glad you used that word transformation, because as a young person, started out, I mean, she was a reflection of her time and her class. And she was early on she was racist, she was anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic. She even was opposed to women's suffrage, for heaven's sakes. And yet, in the course of her life, that all changed. How do you talk a little bit about that transformation? To what do you attribute that vast change?
Well, just to start looking at it from 30,000 feet, I think it's about that transformation, that ability, that transformational quality is a transcendence of self. And by that, I mean, I think Eleanor was a person who all her life was ruthlessly honest in facing herself and facing the problem or the obstacle or the horror that was right in front of her. I don't think she looked away. I don't think she shirked. She couldn't. She was one person in her adult life described her as being addicted to frankness. She was, and when I mentioned about her noticing eye, she looked deeply into things without fear, and it was facing her own fears in the early part of her life. Up through the age of, into her 30s, she was facing substantial fears that she had, phobias and issues with things. She was terrified of insanity because of her father's life, because of his problems and issues. And so going into St. Elizabeth's Hospital as a political wife, as the wife of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, seeing men who were shell-shocked coming home from World War I. She had to force herself to stay in the room with them, to look at them, to listen to them, to know how to say something, not meaningful, but just even human. And I think that one of the things that Eleanor finally, in the wholeness of her life, shows is there's a wonderful notion or idea that Nelson Mandela talks about how we find our own humanity. We can only find our own humanity through the humanity of others. And that connection that Eleanor made always about herself, in that she found her great truths by finding them in others. When she understood her own pain, it was through understanding the pain of others. When it was understanding things about what a woman could and couldn't do with a man like her husband, it was seeing in others similar kinds of pain and not being afraid to understand that this is what was going on with her. I think she was willing to not have answers. I think she was willing to not cling to what seemed safe. I was befuddled for the longest time as a writer, as a biographer, as a storyteller, that none of her issues resolved. And yet it seemed okay with her. And I thought, well, I have to tie this up. This civil rights question that it begins, as you mentioned, in a place where she does not know how to get along with African Americans. She doesn't even know how to shake the hand of an African American person working for her, or how to deal fairly. And yet, by the end of the story, she is a champion of the rights of African Americans and of so many other groups of people who are on the outside of things. She was constantly able to see herself in others and able to live in a way through their questions as if they were her own. And I think that always leads you out of rigidity, she was a listener. I mean, I think that's really another primary part of this, is that I think her listening created a kind of culture, or even just a moment of dignity, of decency, of human dignity. And people always felt lifted up by her listening, by her looking, by the fact that they were not just getting through to her or giving her a problem that she now had to take back to Washington or to the president. They were in a way in a transaction with her when she would see people. Eleanor's one of her great transformations of the office of First Lady and of herself was that people came to the president and Eleanor came to you. And the First Lady had been a static figure, and Eleanor put movement and mobility and motion into the job. She went everywhere. She traveled 40,000 miles even in just her first year alone, meeting people, talking to people, listening, being the president's eyes and ears, doing very practical things, doing a job. But at the same time, wherever she met people, she took people one at a time. The dignity of the individual, was her thing. I mean, if the self was Walt Whitman's litmus test, of democracy, of finding himself in multitudes. For Eleanor, it was the individual. It was always the person that she was with, the person's cause, the person's issue. And she was able, in these moments of contact with people, to inspire in them a feeling that they could give to her, give back to, that they could solve their own problem. It wasn't that she was some Lady Bountiful. She was often misunderstood that way. People would kind of criticize her for being this liberal Lady Bountiful who was going to come in and solve people's problems. That's really not what she did. She inspired people to find their own solutions with her help, with the help of people's of government, of people, of the mechanics, the rusted mechanics of government, which she was beginning to oil and bring back into some relationship for people. But it was that she was an intermediary, allowing you to see that you had a relationship with your government, with your constitution, with other larger forces, and that even though you might feel small or your problem might seem tiny and minuscule, it wasn't. It was part of a larger picture. And she had that ability, and it's called compassion, I guess. It's called dedication or service, but she brought it to life. It was never a word like that. It never became for her a piece of rhetoric or part of a political cause. This is what's so exciting about her for me, was that, I mean, Charles Schulz was a guy who lived in the 4 panels of a daily comic strip. And we all know Snoopy and we all know Charlie Brown, and those characters come alive in us through our imagination. And so what he was doing in that comic strip created this symbiosis with us. And N.C. Wyeth lived through the imagination of children's books and through his own children. But Eleanor lived through history, and her ability to make every day part of our history is what I found. I mean, she was the first Lady to have a syndicated column, and that meant that she every day brought her. I mean, it was one of the first things I found, actually. And when you asked earlier about being inspired, I literally was inspired by this moment I had in the basement of the United Media Syndicate at 200 Madison Avenue, where I was allowed to go down and look at the business papers of Charles Schulz's Peanuts comic strip, where he was a young man writing from Minnesota to the editors at the same syndicate, it turned out. And there was the Schultz boxes under S, bankers boxes all piled up in the basement. And next to it was R, S, all these things were all sort of in. And I opened the lid on this one that said Roosevelt, my day. And there were these long galley sheets. And I started reading, this description of a person saying, the clarity and beauty of these twinkling stars that I'm seeing from my sleeping porch, and during this time of war, bring, into focus what we need in our world. And I was thinking, really? Eleanor Roosevelt wrote this? I mean, it was so beautiful and lovely and connected. And then I went to the next one, and it was all about, some aspect of the war. And I thought, wow, she's really connecting here and saying what's on people's minds and what's on her mind and what's going on. And I thought, I need to get back to this. And that was originally I thought, because I'd always heard that was kind of a ladies column and was published in the ladies section of the newspaper and wasn't particularly subtle or well thought out. It was very beautiful, beautifully written, plain prose, and it was always designed to let you into her life in a way that would then let her get her into yours. And so she connected every day with the readers of, let's say, 1 million or so readers per day. There was a way that she then brought, when she would go to people's towns, it was almost as if with the newsreels and with this newspaper column, she was not just a media star, but she was a much larger than life figure than we know today when we think of people and how people have been sort of reduced by television or now social media. But she was of a presence that seemed to come from Olympus for most people, and yet there she was and was absolutely listening to you and taking care of your issue and bringing you back to the government.
Huh. Well, and that goes to explain one of the things that we found was how many letters people wrote to her. It was if she was their great aunt or whomever, that they could just pour themselves out to her. Hundreds of thousands of letters she would receive.
And from all kinds of people too. I mean, the diversity and the range is extraordinary. Those letters are amazing. Yeah.
Indeed. Wow.
She also replied, by the way, to great numbers of them. I mean, another part of writing Eleanor Roosevelt's biography was that I literally never left this room thinking I'd done my job for the day, because if she'd still be there writing letters into the middle of the night, replying to people like that.
So in working on Eleanor, was your opinion of Franklin changed? What did you think
couldn't
about
help
Franklin?
but be. Yeah, it couldn't help but be. Well, they were such, you're looking at this man who goes from being her fifth cousin, whom she meets at a childhood dance at one of their mutual relatives' houses, to the President of the United States, a man who, when he died and in her last night in the White House, she was writing to Lorena Hickok saying, I always felt safe when Franklin was in the White House, when he was president. And her sense of security about him at that moment of her life, having just lost him as a widow, and her sense of security when she met him because he took her seriously he asked her about books, he asked her about things that other Roosevelts weren't asking her about or no one was asking her about. And he was somewhat of an outsider, the way she was somewhat of an outsider. They were had kind of a compact of oddballs because they both were very odd to their group, their respective peer groups, and they were understanding of one another. So what I had to do was look at Franklin Roosevelt, who, by the way, I admired because he is, and we can't forget, the soldier of freedom. He's the guy who saved us among 3 or 4 major figures without whom, we might be all speaking German now. So I always think of Franklin Roosevelt in the context of World War II. I can't help it. That's how I really see him, as in terms of his greatest achievement. He was a guy who, when in the First World War, when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, said something like, oh gosh, it would be fun to be a war president. I mean, he had a ridiculously blithe and aristocratic and self-fulfilling sense of himself as president. In fact, his idea of the president was himself. I mean, he's a very he's a very contradictory figure in certain ways because he did so much for others and thought so much about others and about. I mean, I think Franklin Roosevelt's truly greatest dream as president of the United States was to make people's lives better. I think literally that's what he wanted to accomplish. He then accomplished something even greater, which was preserving American freedom during one of its greatest challenges. I mean, if he's one of the greats, that's why. But I had to look at him as Eleanor's husband, and this is a terrible way to look at someone. I know this because there's a wonderful, I mean, I love Edward Hopper, the painter, and there's a wonderful biography by a terrific art historian named Gail Levin about Edward Hopper. I think it may still yet be one of the great biographies of Hopper, but there's one problem in it. Gail Levin was handed, I think this is how it worked. I'm going to be a little flip about this, but she was given access to Edward Hopper's wife's diary, and no one had ever written about Hopper with access to this diary. So the story of Hopper in this book becomes something of the story of his wife's view of him, and so that's going to be a version of Hopper that's going to be different from. So I had to look at Franklin as Eleanor's husband. Here is a man who learned to get what he wanted, including love, keep the peace, and make the world a better place by lying to his mother or deceiving her or slightly going around behind her. His world, he grew up in the Hudson Valley, the prince of the household, the only child. His mother's idea of herself, I think, was Franklin. In other words, he was the kind of son who was an extension, whose mother less saw him as a person, more as an extension of herself, because in fact, they do share major personality similarities. They look similar, Franklin and his mother. Franklin and his mother are so alike that he should ever have had an Eleanor Roosevelt in his life is astonishing. And by that, I mean, here's somebody who, as I mentioned earlier, was addicted to frankness, cared for the truth in a way that she saw herself as the safeguard of it, as it being, the truth was her superpower. Understanding the truth and looking at it and facing it was her superpower. Franklin's superpower was getting around the truth. And the simplest way of looking at that was, look what he did. He went from being what was then called a cripple, who would never be president of the United States. Nobody with polio, nobody who could not walk, nobody who was absolutely incapacitated up to their waist by a illness that had left them with legs that would flail away if he lost his balance. I mean, yes, he did learn these techniques. He tortured himself into this ability of standing, but it wasn't that created Franklin Roosevelt as president, as a credible president of the United States, a man standing up, giving a speech. It was that he never allowed you to think of himself as anything other than what he thought of himself as, which was president of the United States, taking the oath of office on the South Portico and looking at the Chief Justice and saying, I will uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's what he had in mind since seeing his idol, Theodore Roosevelt, be inaugurated on those same steps. His cousin Theodore, Eleanor's uncle, a great source of his attraction to Eleanor, the fact that she was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt. They had been, both of them, inspired by the robustness of TR's version of government, but to go from being a man who had lost all strength in his legs, all ability to say to people, I'm anything, I'm not what you think I am. But he never let people think that. And I think that by itself is it's a miracle. It's when you see it beginning to happen, what I was overcome by was a sense of how was she able to allow into this marriage space and freedom that is so contemporary. It's so modern. It's so not what women of her class and time, how they approached a dysfunctional marriage. Her ability to allow Missy LeHand, who became Franklin Roosevelt's, what we call her today, an office wife, would be a 60s version of it. Today, they were absolutely the closest of companions. She did everything for Franklin, and Eleanor remained at his side alongside Missy at crucial moments where you see these three people all working together, doing what they needed to do. The ability of Eleanor to reshape her own thinking about how to find what she needed, including falling in love with a woman, having a love relationship with a woman. I don't think it reframed her. It didn't reframe her sexual identity. I don't think she would have scoffed at the idea of a sexual identity. She would have scoffed at the idea that she was a lesbian. When I began work, she was kind of the gay Thomas Jefferson, or that's how I thought of her, because everyone knew that everyone assumed in historical terms that this Eleanor Roosevelt was somebody who'd been outed, who was gay. Well, she did have relationships with women because she was in search of a kind of love that included whomever loved her, that she had fallen. I mean, she fell for Lorena Hickok as strongly as Lorena Hickok fell for her. The letters that we have between them demonstrate, show, not prove, you can't prove, but they leave you with a sense of someone who was missing a great deal in love, had not gotten what she wanted, was not seeking a new version of herself, but was seeking intimacy, was seeking belonging, was seeking to have the reciprocity of the relationship that she did have with Lorena Hickok. Not for a long time. 7 or 8 years was the sort of center of it. And then it remained a friendship for the rest of her life. And other relationships that she had later on were with men. She continued in her life to seek love in ways that goes outside of category. I mean, you can't really categorize with her in ways that would serve. I mean, you can serve certain narratives with her, but it's pretty hard, I think, to pin her down. I mean, the same is true in some of her politics. She was never for instance, she was never a supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment. And that was not simply, but that was in part because she feared that women, especially working women in the labor movement, would lose almost every one of the rights that they had won if suddenly there was an Equal Rights Amendment. She was constantly seeking the real politics, the practical politics of almost every situation she found herself in. So it is still very hard to put Eleanor Roosevelt into political baskets and political and label her. I found that made her an absolute ideal subject for biography, because I think what biography does best at this point in our literature is it puts into context. And it's so important with Eleanor to see her in the context of her time and understand what she's fighting for and why she's fighting for it because of what's happening around her. I mean, even there was a very good biography of Eleanor called Eleanor and Franklin, not just Eleanor, but of the Roosevelts during the war by Doris Kearns Goodwin, called No Ordinary Time. Some of you may remember it. It was a Pulitzer Prize winner back in the 90s. And it had a kind of a Babar and Celeste version of Franklin and Eleanor. That it's a bit romantic about them, but it's, the reason it's called No Ordinary Time is that until Eleanor, no president's wife had ever dreamed of turning up at a national political convention in 1940 as a power of her own. And it wouldn't happen again until Hillary Clinton. And that version of her, of understanding what she was doing at that convention, why she was there as a power of her own, how she worked the politics, how she worked the delegates, how she made magic, really, a kind of magic on that particular occasion, is so important to see in the context of the war, of the FBI's of suspicions of Henry Wallace, of isolationism, of all the things going on at that moment. So almost every event of Eleanor's life has about a month of studying, I can tell you, of just studying what's going on in these weeks, sometimes these days, sometimes these hours, because you see why she responded to certain things differently than you thought she did because of what was going on. And so it's true of every book of everybody's life. It's wonderful to see what is going on around them that brought on some famous thing. But with Eleanor, it's always a surprise. And I never stopped being surprised.
One of the questions that has come in from our attendees is, what kind of impact do you think she might have in our society today?
Well,
Or what can we learn from her in
yeah,
our society today?
well, she was about the individual, she was about community, and she was about, I think, a culture of dignity and creating a culture of human dignity. I mean, I think that's what her most important achievement, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which some of you may know, some of you may not know, or just have heard of, but essentially, very simply, it was a document that the UN created, that Eleanor, as the head of a committee at the UN, created with the representatives of 30 other countries, 50 countries probably altogether, but the committee itself had about 30 on it. And it was a document that was intended to prevent a recurrence of the horrors and atrocities of World War II. And you had to bring, you had to boil down to 30 items, those rights that were basic to human beings, that needed every human being. It was fundamental to human dignity and human well-being. And what were they? Were they housing? Were they education? Were they physical safety? And what about food? And what, this was people trying to make up their minds across cultures, across religions, across boundaries and borders. And Eleanor, what she did was she created she gave those people the ability to be who they needed to be for their own countries and to be true to themselves, but to protect humanity from itself and from a further cataclysm. They were all living in the shadow of the atomic bomb at the time that they were doing this. But when it was adopted in December of 1948, December 10th, it was the first time the world's nations had agreed together to protect freedom, to protect human rights and equality and dignity on an individual basis. And I think that's a legacy that it certainly has been a hallmark up until very recently of all of our foreign policy and all of our thinking about our relationship, the United States in the world and what the United States could bring to the world. And I think that what Eleanor was very aware of, she said it when she, on the anniversary of the Bill of Rights, she said, if we stop at any point in our thinking about this, if we let down, if we give in to anti-Semitism, if we give into anti-religious fervor, if we give into racial thinking, if we do all that, we're going to stop for the world. We will be unable to give the world the one thing, the one place where people can look to and hope that they will be able to find that there. That's how important American democracy is. And I think she was always aware of the fragility of it because of so many of the things that in her later life that she did as a diplomat, as a representative of the United States, seeing how we really were alone in the world at that time, even though so many of our own, some of the worst horrors that were still going on in our country were happening right then when they were trying to, do this. But Eleanor's, and she never stopped apologizing, and she never stopped being made the more vulnerable because of this. I mean, she was also one of the very first people to see that our own commitment to eugenics in this country, in legal terms, in laws that we passed in the 1920s, were being used by Hitler, by the German, by the Nazis in their programs. She was always facing that sort of thing and saying, we have to do better. And I think that in her wish to expand democracy, to include more people, that her wish to make the United States a better place is the thing that keeps her fresh today. I mean, she didn't have in her 78 years of life, 1884, 1962, she didn't have a multi-racial, inclusive democracy. She was fighting for it until she was 36 years old. You didn't vote in this country if you were her. The people that she worked for, the institutions she worked in, were all dominated by white men. Almost all the power was held by rich white men. And she was related to some of them. I mean, she was right inside that world. So she knew how far people still had to go. The fact she didn't live to see the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that she did not live to see the United States outlaw mob violence and lynching formally. I mean, not until a couple of years ago. So what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is all the issues that were alive to her are extraordinarily still alive. And I, this was personal to me in one sense. I began this book in 2009, and one of my very first thoughts, another inspiring thought, was, wow, I'm going to get to, and this was a very vague idea in a way when I think about it now, but I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to get to go through the life, study the life of Eleanor Roosevelt while the first African-American president is in the White House. And I had an assignment very early on in 2010 to go to Washington and write about Mrs. Obama. It was called Mrs. Obama's Washington. I wrote about Michelle Obama for Condé Nast Traveler, about her relationship to the city, to Washington, D.C., and her plans as First Lady for the relationship that the White House would have with the city, and which was a very Eleanor thing, by the way, and very much in the context of Eleanor. And I went to the White House and interviewed Mrs. Obama. And so I was under this illusion, powerful illusion, because I was actually even going to the White House itself, that somehow this was all going to look different now. And we all had this illusion. There was a moment there where people were talking about, we're beyond racism, we're living in a post-racial America, we're living in this world. Well, Black Lives Matter it wasn't even a thought at that moment that we would be where we are today. And so I guess what I'm saying is, there was a moment where I thought I was writing Eleanor's life in one context, and then 2016 came along, and I remember the moment of being was going into the city to vote. I used to vote in the city, and I was on the train, and the doors opened, and I wasn't paying attention to my surroundings at that moment, and until the doors opened, and I looked out, and there it said Chappaqua, and there was bunting, red, white, and blue bunting, political bunting was hanging in the Chappaqua train station, and I thought to myself, oh my God, I'm in the hometown of the first female president of the United States. I was overwhelmed, moved beyond words. I remember tearing up and thinking, wow, this is amazing. Doors closed, we went into the city, and then the rest happened. And because the rest happened, everything looked different. Had Hillary Clinton, bless her, had Mrs. Clinton, had Secretary Clinton become president of the United States, this book would look different. Book would be different. Everything about things would have been different. It was the awakening of the next 5-7 years that convinced me that Eleanor's life was absolutely in the present tense in one way, and politically anyhow, and not necessarily personally, but politically. And she always said, she wanted people to be stronger and wiser. She wanted us to live more imaginatively and bravely, without fear, without want. It's a quote, it's one of her great quotes. But all those words became different. Living bravely, living imagine, all those things just changed meaning, back to her original meaning, all through the horror that we've lived through politically in this country, and in every way for 7 years. And I think that Eleanor would be the first to be very kind about that, and very understanding, and very logical, and very firm and clear and powerful in her responses. And I kept trying to hold on to all that. And I guess that's what she is. She's a great keel of a boat. That's like, you need her. We need her. I was always amazed. I would think, boy, Franklin needed her, but we need her. I mean,
so do we.
Yeah. I mean, and I saw, I could see how I loved his responses. One of the things people have said to me a number of times, boy, I really have a different impression of Franklin Roosevelt from reading your book. You were pretty tough on him. I think you really revealed things about him that I didn't know before. And I'd always say, yeah, but he loved her. He really did. And he respected her. And in that love, there's a moment where the two of them have just lost, in a way, the two most important people in their deepest lives. He's just lost his mother in September of 1941. Franklin Roosevelt without his mother is a very strange animal. And by the way, he only lived for 4 more years without her. But so Sarah dies, and a tree, by the way, falls over on that property on a sunny day up in Hyde Park, just because it falls over, just because she's gone. And so, this just planetary event has happened in his life. And at exactly the same week, her brother, who was her only other living relative, she was marooned in childhood. The two of them had been marooned when they lost their father. Eleanor's father died when she was 10. When her mother died when she was 9. Their older brother, a second child, died when she was 9. Then her father died when she was 10. So she and her brother Hall were just marooned as orphans and left to live with her grandmother. And here, with the death of Franklin's mother, came this week where her brother died, having drunk himself to death at a very young age. And a very smart, bright guy, always just about to make it in his own life. And then the alcoholism would reassert itself. So a very tragic figure. And he died, and Eleanor was right with him right to the end at Walter Reed. And so she goes down to the White House to tell Franklin that she's lost Hall. And he is there at his desk in the Oval Office with a black armband, and he looks up. He looks up at her, and they are totally in tune as grieving people. And he says, "Come over, Babs, come over." And she sits on his lap, and he holds her. I mean, this is an amazing scene for two wasps. Two extremely, people who are so awkward. These two individuals who are so awkward with each other, so hard for them to be intimate and loving, are so necessary and loving to each other in this moment of grief, of deepest grief. And the war, and she goes off the next morning to become the first lady to serve as a government official, as co-director of the Office of Civil Defense. Pearl Harbor happens. It's always Netflix with the Roosevelts. I mean, it's always these moments, and then these huge, big world events, and then another personal moment, and it's dizzying, by the way, to follow it. It's also incredibly exciting, and also I was daunted at first by the fact that I was a man writing about a woman. I was daunted by the idea of writing about world history, which is not my field. I'm not a historian. All these limitations sort of present themselves when you look at the Roosevelts from the outside, or from 30,000 feet at the very beginning. But it's a little like my favorite comedy, Some Like It Hot, which ends with the great line, "Nobody's perfect." And the Roosevelts, that's the thing that's lovely about them. They're not perfect.
They're not perfect.
And they kind of assert their humanness and that they're people all the time. And I wanted people not to think differently of Franklin, harshly of Franklin. I wanted them to see how she saw him and how difficult it was to love him and to be close to him. He was not interested in being, Franklin Roosevelt was very interested in himself, in a nice way, in the best of all ways, in a way. But he had his own interests always going, and as I say, in a good way, in the best way. But it made it really tough for her, and I just loved how much they, not just the mawkish, lachrymose scene, but I love that she would say to him, "Are you going to have trouble if I put this in my column tomorrow morning?" And he would look it over and he'd say, "You know what? Just put it in, and if I get any grief, I'll just tell him I can't control you." And they always had a kind of, meta kind of ability to laugh at their situation, the situation they were in, and they were lovely in a way with each other. They were also very testy, and like any old married couple, she'd come in with a new pile of papers, put it in the his basket next to where he was shaking the cocktails, and say, "Franklin, you must look at that." And he'd just be shaking, "Oh, Babs, clear out. I'm having my cocktail. It is cocktail hour. Come on, have a sippy." I mean, he's a lovely guy. He's also a bully. He's also a little cruel. He's also lovely. I mean, he's a human being. That's the thing about Franklin. He's so human. And they also both, Eleanor, they both looked at death in a way that I found very reassuring, not just because I'm 63, and therefore toward the latter third of my life, looking at the latter third of my life, but they both had faith, They both had deep faith, different in varying ways. They had different deep faith. But Eleanor was a very faithful person who was fearless in a certain way about her. She didn't necessarily know in the end, she said, whether there was an afterlife or what exactly it was going to be. She had no clear or dogmatic or even very tightly held view. But she looked at her own self as a traveler in it, or as a spirit, as something that was going to be present. And she never stopped, I think, accepting herself as a sort of life force, and seeing herself as something who was going to go beyond and transcend. And I found that very reassuring. She was beset with tuberculosis at the end of her life, in a way what we would think of as early today. She was 75 when it became present, and no one knew what it was for a while, and she suffered a great deal of the medical interventions of a man she deeply loved and was actually living with at the time, her doctor, David Gurevich, who tried heroically to save her. But her ability to see herself in perspective and see her life in perspective, and to be unafraid of whatever lay ahead, was, I found, deeply moving and inspiring. She was she was very perceptive, I think, about seeing how other people's fears could be treated, and so she knew how to handle people. But she never stopped allowing people to kind of do whatever they needed to do, and I think that was part of the freedom that she gave others.
David, I'm conscious of the time, and I want to take a couple questions from the chat. Yeah. One of them is about your research. They ask about, you have new information, and how did you go about your research? What did you do?
Well, I did all the things that you'd expect somebody to do who's writing about Eleanor Roosevelt, which was partly there's 1 million documents in Hyde Park that are there in cartons that you begin to go through, and you realize, her handwriting is atrocious, and you're never going to get through 1 million documents. So right away you have to accept that. And there was a great guy there, Bob Clark, supervisory archivist, and they were moving the cartons when there was a remodeling going on. And I was kind of pale looking at these things and thinking, what am I doing here? This is way more than I can chew. And he said to me, this is why you're here, David. We need a selector, not a collector. And so I saw pretty early on that thoroughness and my father was born in Berlin, and was a scientist, my naturally Germanic nature of thoroughness was going to kill me this time if I gave into it. So that I had to learn a new way of climbing this mountain, and being more nimble and moving quickly. And there were big collections. One of them was up at the Houghton Library at Harvard, that involved Theodore Roosevelt and Eleanor's father's family. And that was my one big mistake. I'll just say right away. I spent 2 years tracking in the Theodore Roosevelt collection something that happened to me very early on, which was that I noticed that Elliot Roosevelt's alcoholism and his self-medication and his addiction to laudanum wasn't well understood by Eleanor or by her children, and that it was left a kind of mystery. And I thought, well, it's really worth looking into his childhood and see how things worked out. And it's too long a story. It's way too long a story to go into. But basically, I discovered a couple of things in the collection up at Harvard, reading the letters of Eleanor's grandparents, where they were trying to figure out why their kids were sick at certain times. Asthma is a famous thing for Teddy Roosevelt. But one of the medications that was being dished out by Eleanor's grandmother, a Southerner, Mittie Bullock Roosevelt, to her children at all times was a mercury-based medicine that was having terrible impact. Sure. And I started tracking in this sort of forensic, biographer, forensic historians kind of way, what was going on with all this. And it was shortened by Mittie Bullock Roosevelt to its Latin initials, HRC. Hydrocarbon concreta, which is the Latin word for mercury, and it was in this medication called calomel, which you find in Gone with the Wind. It's such a Southern woman's medication at the time. It was also something that appeared as blue pill in the worlds of Walt Whitman and Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln And Theodore Roosevelt Sr. took blue pill regularly. He also was a mirror maker. Their hardware store on Maiden
Oh.
Lane was just then transferring from plate glass to the making of mirrors. I found that he was bringing home balls of mercury to the kids to play with. We used to do that when we were kids too. Anyway, that sent me off onto this, and I'm just telling this at some length just to say, that's the kind of research I thought I was doing. And I wrote 200 to 300 pages of what I thought was going to be my first sort of chapter, the big panel of the Roosevelt history. I gave it to Alice Mayhew, Simon & Schuster, when she took me out to lunch, and she had this moment where she said, this is incredible. Why haven't we learned this before? And then she looked at me and she said, are you writing a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt? It was like, and if so, where is it? I mean, why have you given me 200 pages of a history of the Roosevelts? Are you writing? I mean, she was so confused as to who she was having lunch with, because it said nothing about Eleanor. So I was being indulgent. I was being insane, in fact, because so much of my research sent me. I just want to mention 2 other things really quickly, which is the internet was not a big thing without N.C. Wyeth. I mean, it wasn't a thing at all. If Disneyland had a biography ride, it was N.C. Wyeth, and I was on that for 8 years in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. That was an entirely different world. Charles Schultz was also very similar. Not so much internet, although digitally to be able to access Peanuts became an enormous tool for me to find where the word love appears in Peanuts. 18,000 comic strips, and you can now digitally search it. That's an extraordinary tool. Similarly, Eleanor was the first lady to include women in the press coverage of the first lady. She had women's press conferences. She gave items to women reporters. She was covered every day from dawn to dusk, from dawn to deadline, by no fewer than 20 people, and very closely by 3 to 10 people. Because of the rabbit holes, because of newspapers.com and all the others, you can see that coverage every single day. Well, imagine, I mean, you're getting quotes from Eleanor that don't exist in any previous history books. This is the first draft of history you're reading. And so it's very compelling to read the observations of the reporters, to read Eleanor, we're talking about newspaper copy here. We're not talking, I mean, of course I would go to those papers also and look at their diaries or whatever they were writing that were left in their papers in the Library of Congress. So it was always archivally based for me, but I found myself deeply falling into rabbit holes for the first time because of the internet. And I warn anybody. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote about Eleanor was because both N.C. Wyeth and Charles Schultz, both those books are, I would just call them, broadly speaking, access biography, meaning to write those books, I had to get access. But you, Mary, can go to Hyde Park and write a Eleanor Roosevelt biography starting tomorrow morning, and anybody listening can also. And that was actually a really sexy idea to me, because I wanted to be closer to my subject than I ever been before, because I thought I will be without a family or people around who are living their lives in the present, who you interact with, you get to know, and you're involved with, like it or not, and you're involved with them first, then your subject. But I wanted to be involved with my subject first, and that's what happened with Eleanor. The research actually allowed that, and it was very exciting to me. And I think probably 9 years was also poorly spent, but really well spent, because I did allow the research to go on probably longer than I should, or I would go back. As I mentioned, it was then a matter of coming each month or spending time as I moved through her life, because you can't do all the research and then you just go right. I wrote it in pieces and studied her life in pieces. And from 2016 on, things looked different. So I would go back and and oral histories were very important to me also. People's memories of Eleanor. They were as important, I'd say, in certain ways as interviews. Some of the ones I did myself, although some of the ones I did myself were with one of Eleanor's surviving grandchildren, the oldest grandchild, Eleanor Seagrave, extraordinary woman who evoked her grandmother. So there was that, all of those different things. And then also my day, which is the Eleanor's column, which I began every day reading, just as I had with Peanuts. I had the task of reading, 20 to 30 Peanut strips every morning when I began that book. This book, I would read, 5 or 6 of Eleanor's columns just to just to get the music. And I would
Get in the
put on
mood.
Aaron Copeland in my studio here and listen to Aaron, which always sounded to me like Eleanor. And I'd, you know, music for the common man, and I would read her, and it was just, oh my God, you know. So
Well-
half the time, you know, my face would be wet from you know, tears, and I'd be just overwhelmed with how she wrote and how beautiful she was.
Well, your enthusiasm is catching. It's
Oh.
it's moving. I really appreciate it. I'm going to ask you one very short question.
Yes.
There have been several movies and TV shows
Oh, yeah.
made. Who do you think, which actress best portrays Eleanor?
So far, I don't think we've seen her. I mean, this is what
Okay.
I genuinely, you know, I watched Maid. I don't know if you saw it. It's a Netflix series, but the daughter of Andy McDowell, who plays the lead character in Maid, suddenly looked to me like a sort of youngish Eleanor. But I keep seeing Eleanors nowadays, of course.
I'm sure.
and a extraordinary musical talent, Zoe Sarnak, is going to write a musical based on Eleanor, and
Wow.
is really well suited and equipped and talented and beyond to write such musical. So we'll see how what shapes up in terms of that casting. But I think that Gillian Anderson, who's going to play Eleanor in a series that includes all the first ladies, I think she's going to do a great job. She was she played the Iron Lady. She played Margaret Thatcher, and I think she has a kind of gravitas and stature in her own work that will translate to Eleanor in a really exciting way. I'm looking forward to
That's great.
that one. There was one who, I don't know if you saw, the Hyde Park on Hudson. There was a lovely moment where one of the reviewers said, every time this actress who plays Eleanor Roosevelt comes on the screen and then exits, we just want to follow her off into whatever movie that is. And that is the thing about Eleanor, is that I think she will make an endlessly great subject for, you know, musical and for
That's great.
TV.
Well, what a good place to stop. David, thank you so much. You've
Thank
been
you,
so
Mary.
generous with your time and your
Thank you all. I'm sorry we're not at the
enthusiasm.
library, but thank
subject.
you.
Absolutely. And to all of you, we want to let you know that on Monday, January 31st, the Friends of Ferguson Library, in partnership with the Mayor's Multicultural Council, will present another author event, an evening with Roya Hakekian, author of A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. So registration is going currently. There will be an in-person event, and it will also be available on Zoom. So we hope that you will join us there. So again, our thanks to you, David. We're so grateful. And to all of you who tuned in tonight. Good night.
Good night.